Hello, welcome to Lecture 1 for LMC 3212 Women in Literature and Culture. As you know, this semester we're going to be specifically studying women in speculative fiction with an emphasis on women writing science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I'm Professor Lisa Yazik, and again, this is Lecture 1, and today we're going to be exploring women in classic science fiction. So, women writing science fiction before 1960. All right. Now, women, we tend to think about science fiction as a genre for white boys and their toys, but the reality is women have been founders and pioneers within science fiction, and they've been involved in every aspect of science fiction production from the very beginning. More often than not, women use this as their opportunity to stake claims for themselves in the future imaginary. While science often makes women the subjects of inquiry and the targets of technological manipulation, science fiction is a way to speak back and to get other voices out there, giving us other versions of science, society, and gender. What you're going to see quite often in women's science fiction is an emphasis on staking claims for women in the future imaginary by imagining the adventures of the sisters of tomorrow. That is, women, often technoscientifically adept women, working with other people, especially other women, to make the future a better and more just place for all. Or sometimes to criticize the failure of other people to create futures that are truly better and just futures for all. Now, like all science fiction authors, women writing science fiction are inspired and have always been inspired by both scientific and social change. Indeed, they were some of the first authors to actually insist that science fiction needed to be not just about science, but its impact on society, right? What we find is that while the women who write science fiction are as varied as the women who comprise any other part of the world, you are going to find that quite often women science fiction writers are inspired by feminists and other progressive-minded people seeking to change the world. And so the goal of this particular lecture is to map 19th and 20th century early 20th century women's science fiction traditions, especially in relationship to the development of modern feminism itself. All right, now before we begin, we did a great job working together to define science fiction, and I want to keep using that class definition that we came up with together on the first day. But I also want to give you a more formal definition that comes from the first science fiction scholar. His name was Darko Suvin. I don't care if you ever remember his name again, but I did want you to hear it. And he came up with this definition in 1979. So obviously science fiction had already been around for a long, long time, but it was just becoming a discipline within the academy and within universities. And so he's one of the first people to try to legitimize the study of science fiction. And one of the things he wanted to do was to give people who didn't know the field a working definition that got them away from sort of simple, exaggerated ideas about ray guns and sexy aliens, basically. Not that those aren't awesome, but they're not the whole of science fiction. So what Darko Suvin talks about is he says that there are three characteristics to science fiction. That science fiction is defined by the presence of a novum. That's the Latin word for a new thing. And here we mean specifically the technological or scientific new thing that creates the science fiction world, that makes its difference from our own world. That's called the novum. So for instance, here's just a really famous and not example, has nothing to do, I guess, with gender, but Star Wars, right? Star Wars has two novums, right? Space travel, because you can't have the Star Wars and the Galactic Empire apart without that, and the Force. And that's a little bit more of a mystical, almost fantastic novum, right? That's where Star Wars sort of moves towards fantasy, perhaps. But you get the point of where I'm going home. Those are the two things that make the difference in that world. All right, great. So I'm trying to think about an example I can give you from a women's science fiction story recently. Well, how about if any of you have seen A Wrinkle in Time, right? The difference that makes the difference there, of course, is the presence of aliens. Okay. maybe that one works. Let's keep going. You get where I'm going here. All right. So the presence of a novum. The second characteristic that you want to have in science fiction is an alternate historical framework. Science fiction happens in some world that's other than our own. More often than not, we tend to associate science fiction with the present or the future, right? But we also can have science fiction stories set in an alternate past. Star Wars is long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. You can also have science fiction set in an alternate present, a present world that's a lot like ours, but just one or two things are a little bit different, scientifically or technologically, and it makes that world pretty different than our own. A great example of this is the Black Mirror TV series. Okay. Third and finally, science fiction is characterized by a reading process, and this is very different than the reading process in realist fiction, or what we sometimes call mainstream fiction, right? Mainstream fiction attempts to represent the world as it is, and so when you read a story, you should recognize all those parts of the world, right? We feel cognitive familiarity. That's what that phrase is there, that our brains get what's going on. In science fiction, we have a different reading experience. We have the experience of cognitive estrangement, or sometimes it's called cognition and estrangement, a process that shifts us back and forth. Both of them are important. So what happens in science fiction is you go in and you recognize parts of the world because it's based on the laws of physics and biology that are similar to our own world. But then there's that difference, something that's different, the novum that makes the difference in the world. And that induces estrangement in us. We say, what is this? Why is the world like this? How did things get this way? And in a science fiction book, we expect someone at some point to explain to us how indeed the world got that way. Professor Exposition at some point is going to take out her pipe and light it and give you a 20-minute lecture on why things are the way they are. Sometimes it's handled a little more gracefully than that. Sometimes it's handled just like that. But that, in theory, returns you as the viewer or reader to cognition. You're then in cognitive familiarity, like, oh, I get it. I get why the world is like this. And it feels plausible because if things sort of went like that in our world, yeah, that would be the result. The interesting thing that often happens with the best of science fiction, and this is going to be especially true for women's science fiction, is that you begin the story feeling estranged. You end the story with cognitive familiarity. But then you leave the story and you go back to the real world and you feel cognitive estrangement again because you look around at your world and you say, why isn't my world awesome the way that this world is awesome? Or, oh my goodness, the horrible things that happened in that world have analogs in our world and I have to stop these things from ever happening for real. Okay? So that's what you're going to see happen often with women's science fiction, and especially when it's allied with feminist or other kinds of politically minded thinking. All right. So I just wanted you to have that as another set of tools you can use as we explore science fiction over the next few weeks. You should be able, in any story we go into, to jump in. Tell me what the novum is. Tell me what the alternate historical framework is. Are we in the past, present, or future? And what's the cognitive estrangement that's going on? What are the parts that are challenging? And then what are the parts that teach us to see our own world differently? A few other things, and again, I think we're just reiterating points that you all made in class. I want to point out that science fiction needs to be plausible. That's a word you should be familiar with and using, because it is logically extrapolated. You want to use that phrase, logically extrapolated from what we currently believe to be true about science and society. You can also think about science fiction as a virtual laboratory. That's another phrase we use a lot. Talking about it as a virtual laboratory for working through possible courses of action, right? A few other things I would note that are key characteristics of science fiction, and that may be different than what we see in fantasy and horror, is science fiction celebrates humans as agents of change, even as it insists that they are not the center of the universe. So science fiction assumes that history is fluid and malleable, that today is different than yesterday, in part because of the actions that humans have taken to change their environments. And we can assume that tomorrow will be different than today for many of the same reasons. All right, that's a central notion to science fiction, and it puts humans in the position of agents or actors, that they are people who can do things that transform the world, both for better and for worse. At the same time, science fiction generally assumes that we humans are not the center of the universe, that there's a big, marvelous universe out there. There may be other beings, other orders of life that are as important as ours, and perhaps even more important. Finally, and again, this is going to be really important for our work on women in science fiction. Science fiction always entails a shift in perspective and a rethinking of the world as it is. This is part of what we were getting at when I talked about cognition and estrangement, or specifically cognitive estrangement, the idea that your mind just suddenly sees things differently, right? So obviously, sometimes you'll go into our stories and you'll think one way about the world, and when you come out, you'll think a different way. Okay, so that's something we're looking at too, those shifts in perspective. So now here's the question, why are women drawn to science fiction? As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, a lot of people assume that science fiction is about boys and their toys, and it is true that often when people name science fiction authors, they come up with male names. Isaac Asimov, James Cameron, who could we think of more recently? Andy Weir with The Martian, for instance. But, you know, women have always written science fiction and have always been part of the science fiction community. And what we're going to see is that during the period of classic science fiction, just so you know, as a heads up, women will comprise about 15% of the community, and they're going to fill all positions as authors, editors, artists, fans, etc., science journalists, etc. When we get in 2 weeks, when we do contemporary science fiction, we'll see the number of women in science fiction double. And depending on what you count as science fiction, the numbers today go anywhere from about women comprising 35 to about 45% of people within the genre. So why is it then that women are drawn to science fiction? Why did women start working on this, especially if women came to science fiction in the 1800s and early 1900s, when science and engineering were being defined as masculine activities? How does this work with science fiction? So as I had mentioned earlier in my overview, right? If you think about it this way, women are often the subjects of scientific scrutiny and targets of technological manipulation in modern culture. Science fiction gives women a way to insert their own voice into widespread debates about science, society, and gender, and sometimes to make their voices heard more widely than they might even in science or technology itself. In short, we can think about women's science fiction as providing us with the opportunity to create feminist fairy tales. And in fact, another reason that I am sure women writers are drawn, especially those who are thinking about changing the world, to science fiction, is because feminists use the same speculative techniques that science fiction authors use. Feminists, like science fiction authors, want to educate us about some topic, in this case usually sex and gender, often related to science and technology, and they do it by estranging us from the world as we think we know it, giving us new perspectives on what's missing now, and celebrating what could be possible in the future if women and other like-minded people work together. Other kind of interesting things is both science fiction and feminism assume that change is a group effort. Yes, science fiction, especially in the West, often celebrates the individual genius or the individual bad guy. But more often than not, even that individual genius has to make connections with other people, and they have to work together to either stop the bad guy or to make the world a better place, or both in many cases, right? Or the bad woman, who knows, the bad person, let's just say that. Okay, cool. So what you're going to see is that early on in science fiction, women get defined, especially by male authors, in one of two ways. They're either the passive love interest or a threatening, beautiful alien monster. And that's actually a phrase, you want to know both of those phrases. The love interest, right? This is a role that women tend to play in lots of different genre fiction. The one thing I will say is even when women are being super passive love interests or damsels in distress in science fiction, they usually have a good reason for being there. They're often the scientist's daughter or sister. Perhaps they even are scientists in their own right. But there's usually some reason they're there. Nonetheless, they still end up being pretty passive. It's the guys that do all the action and save the day. The only time that we see women being particularly active in early science fiction by men is when they are the beautiful alien monsters. And you can call that the BAM for short. And yes, that really is technical science fiction studies terminology, I expect you to know, okay? So BAMs, they're threatening, right? They're beautiful, and they're threatening because they're smarter and more technologically or scientifically adept than the human men who meet them, but the human men still think they're hot. And there's that tension, right, between being attracted to the beautiful alien monster and being worried that she's going to take you over, that she'll be the dominant person in your relationship. Instead, what you're going to find is women writers take those character types and they either twist them and turn them, or they create new character types, and that we're going to see women figured as alien others and strangers traveling through strange lands. And often friendly alien others and friendly strangers traveling through strange lands. What happens? There's a general pattern you'll find in women's science fiction, is that it often tends to be both critical and creative. It can take either one of those modes, but sometimes you'll see both. So often what you'll find is that women's science fiction outlines the problems or the difficulties that women face as they negotiate new scientific and social hierarchies in our world. And then at the same time, or often in the end, it will offer solutions in the guise of other worlds and other people and places and times where women work together and with, like I said, other like-minded people to make the world a better place. They'll do this often as a sort of reorganized kind of scientist or engineer called the domestic scientist or engineer. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. And women also use a character called the happy or unhappy housewife heroine to evaluate the relative success at technoscience making the world better for women and families. All right. So before I jump in and talk with you about the history of classic feminism and classic women's science fiction, I want to briefly note that there's a really long history of both proto-feminism and proto-science fiction. Speculative stories about science, society, and gender go back at least to the 10th century BCE in Japan. There's a story about a moon princess who rejects her royal suitors because she wants to spend time with her family and in the home, controlling her own life and her own art. So that's a really, really early story, right, that uses like ideas about encounters with alien others, different temporal planes, etc., to explore what is the role of a good woman in a modern society. In the West, we see proto-feminism and proto-science fiction begin in the 17, 18, and 1900s. And a great early story, I wish we had the time to read it, someone should totally do this for a final project, is I would recommend that some of you look at Margaret Cavendish's 1666 story, The Blazing World, which explores the problem of what it means to be a woman with the intellectual and physical appetites usually ascribed to men. And in this story, Margaret Cavendish imagines herself as a warrior philosopher queen who is attractive to men and women alike, and who has the power over both animals and technologies across space and time. Today, we might see that kind of character in a film like the Wachowski sisters' Jupiter Rising, right? A woman whose place on Earth is wrong and who's not given the credit for all of the intellect and power that she really holds. Other people, of course, begin the history of modern science fiction with Mary Shelley, whose Frankenstein from 1818 did indeed give us two of our most important science fiction images, that of the mad scientist and that of the misunderstood creature, right? And in particular, if you've read Frankenstein, as you know, Frankenstein, again, seems to be about boys and their toys, and of course we have a passive love interest who's actually killed by the bad actions of the mad scientist. But when you really look at the story, right, it's not, of course, a celebration of any of that. It's a condemnation of it. And the whole point of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is that science will go dreadfully wrong if male scientists cut themselves off from female morality and intellect, right? So basically, when scientists refuse to hang out with their families and refuse to listen to the wisdom of their mothers, they become bad dads who end up sealing the deaths rather than the continued lives of their families. All right. Another marvelous, amazing female progenitor to women's science fiction is the enslaved African-American poet Phyllis Wheatley, who wrote poetry. She was enslaved and brought to America in the 1700s. She did eventually win her freedom, but, still, right? All right, anyways, Phyllis Wheatley is really amazing. And if you look at her poetry, she merges Christian imagery with precise scientific detail to imagine Black people not as angels, but as star children whose imagination can literally create the mothership that will rescue them from earthly oppression and send them shooting out into space where they will be literally above it all, right? This kind of thinking comes to fruition in the contemporary storytelling tradition called Afrofuturism, stories about Black people imagining spaces for themselves in the future. And ideas about star children and the mothership are literally at the center of the performances of a number of 20th and 21st century Black American musicians, including the great jazz musician Sun Ra. From the 1970s, we have George Clinton and P-Funk, who literally built a mothership that would descend onto the stage while they were playing. When the pandemic is over, you can go to the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and see the mothership. And then, of course, probably more familiar to all of us today is Janelle Monáe, who imagines herself as both a star child and an android and anything else you can imagine, right? And in particular, for those of you who followed her Metropolis suite and her work as the character Cindy Mayweather begins as an android on the run for falling in love with a man, but in the end recognizes her destiny as a star child and goes off planet and takes people with her in the mothership of Black imagination. All right, these are amazing, great mothers to modern science fiction. I hope that some of you will consider, when you get to final project time, going backwards and looking at some of them and learning where the tropes and themes and techniques we use today to talk about science and technology and gender and race come from. All right, so that's your deep history. Now what I want to go on is really focus on the period extending from about 1848 to 1960, and we're going to call that the period of both classic feminism and classic women's science fiction. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about what's going on with feminism in this period. As you know, or if you don't know, now you know, this period of feminism is often known as first wave feminism. And while feminists in this period had lots of different political and social identities and lots of different ideas about what was wrong in the world and what needed to be fixed, there was one single issue that feminists of all different stripes were able to come to agreement on, and that was for universal suffrage, the right for women to vote. All right, so feminism, and so that's going to be really central to the idea of representation. The idea of representation in the public is going to be central to both feminism and feminist science fiction, right? So feminism in the U.S. officially begins in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. And again, the main issue was suffrage for women. One of the most famous feminists of this era was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You probably won't need to know her in great detail, but it's good you should know her name. She's a founding mother of American feminism. And she represented liberal humanist feminism, which is the most common type of feminism in the United States. This is a mode of feminism that says, okay, democracy is based on the idea of equal representation in the public sphere and equal opportunity for all. And yet what we see is that today women do not have those equal opportunities and equal access of men. And so liberal humanist feminism is about working within current political and economic and social systems to fulfill the American dream and to really generate democracy and equal access and representation for all. All right, And just so you know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton did this in a really interesting way. She kicked off the Seneca Falls Convention with what I would call a piece of feminist speculative fiction. What she did is she stood up there and she read the Declaration of Independence, but it was a rewritten Declaration of Independence that invoked the language of democracy and the rhetoric of equal rights to argue against the tyranny of patriarchy and for equal political representation regardless of sex. And so that's a speculative activity, rewriting texts we have to imagine a different future. Now, other feminists from this time period took a more subtle approach. And so while people like Stanton, they fought conventional ideas about women as naturally maternal, as naturally domestic, as angels in the house. That was the phrase that was really popular in the 19th century. To talk about women, well, women didn't need the vote because they were angels in the house. They're naturally pure, they're naturally submissive to men, but they're morally superior to men, and they're intensely domestic, and they're just happier in the house. Okay, some women were happier in the house, and it sure as heck beat working in a factory or on a farm 18 hours a day. But even those women who were happy to be in the home sometimes wanted more. And one of the ways that women argued for equal political action or equal access to the political sphere was by invoking conventional ideas about women as caretakers and homemakers, and arguing that we needed women in politics to do what was called municipal housekeeping. So that's a phrase you should know, right? So some women were arguing for equality. They said, we are new women. That was a phrase. We're going to be women who are equal to men, and we're going to make democracy live up to its own goals. And again, that's very much a type of feminism we still see at the heart of modern feminism today. Other women, like I said, are going to be making arguments about how there are indeed natural differences between men and women. And sure, that's fine. And so what they would do is, instead of saying, no, there's no differences, we really, in all the fundamental ways, are equal, they would say, yeah, men and women are different. And you're right. Women are morally better than men. And we are better at domestic stuff than men. And we do have that moral authority from God. And we don't want to leave the home. We want to stay home and take care of our husbands and our kids. But the men have just messed things up so bad that we're called by God to go out and do municipal housekeeping and to use our moral purity and our killer domestic skills to turn the whole world into an outside home and to make it safe and secure for all. So that was another kind of argument that you would see. So that kind of argument you'll find is pretty central to a lot of early Black feminists. And if you think about it, that makes sense. Black feminists are having to fight all of the sexual stereotypes that white women fight, plus they're fighting ideas about Black women as intellectually inferior, morally suspect, and often sexually promiscuous. So it became really important for Black feminists to take back the Bible and rewrite it and really embrace that idea that Black women are indeed morally pure, super strong, excellent mothers and caretakers, and as such, ready to take care not just of their own homes, but the world as a whole. And you see this in particular in the work, you'll see this often in Sojourner Truth, very famous early Black feminist, who invoked the Bible to argue that while Lilith upset the world, Martha and Mary prove that women have worked with God to set it right in the past, and that they'll do so again in the present. And as Sojourner Truth was quick to point out, ain't no human man involved in the creation of Jesus Christ. It was the work of a human woman and God. And so those are the people now who have to set the world of men correct. It's a clever argument. And the thing is, a lot of people even today get a little up in arms about liberal humanist feminism and issues of equality. It's trickier. If you start to use these traditional ideas about women as wives and mothers, you get people to listen for a little while. Of course, the trade-off is you're still playing into very conventional stereotypes and potentially limiting your influence. On the other hand, you're finding an opportunity to exert another kind of influence. All right, so that's all going on. White women were also really interested in the idea of municipal housekeeping, and in fact, women scientists embraced it quite eagerly. We see this especially in the work of Dr. Ellen Swallow Richards. Again, I'm not worried if you know these names or not, but you might want to know them and check them out just for yourself. Dr. Richards was one of the first engineering PhDs in the United States, and in fact, she should have been the first person of any sex to graduate with a PhD in engineering. MIT was the first school to offer that degree, and they were so freaked out, the people who ran that program, when they realized that Richards would be the first person to graduate, that they purposely held her back for 5 years so they could graduate men first. Never one to be set back by something as like that. Richards then promptly devoted her career to showing why it was ridiculous to celebrate male engineers over female engineers. And in fact, she spent decades showing how women could use engineering principles to transform both the home and the world at large. This was called domestic engineering, and it's a concept you're going to see a lot of in women's science fiction. So you're going to want to look for this. You'll want to look for these ideas about equality, looking for democratic equality, looking for women's work as municipal housekeeping, and thinking about women's work as domestic engineering, right? So we're going to see a range of ways that women are positioning themselves in the public sphere, and a range of ways that they'll position themselves in women's science fiction. All right, so after women received the vote in 1920, feminism seemed to become a secondary issue in the minds of a lot of Americans. And there were a couple reasons for this. First of all, it seemed like feminists had gotten their goal. They got the vote. Now, of course, the reality was a lot more complicated than that. First and foremost, Black women didn't really have the option to vote until the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. They were often kept away by poll taxes and other intimidation tactics, as were all Black people. And of course, feminists had from the beginning, other things that they were interested in. Women were interested in equality in education, equality in the workplace, equality in sexuality. They were looking for better divorce rights, better custody rights with children. Many of the things that we see, equal pay, the issues that still we grapple with today, those were all there too. But because those weren't single platform issues, and feminist groups often broke apart to work on those smaller issues, it seemed like feminism wasn't as central to the American imagination. And then, of course, you also have a lot of other things going on, right? The Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War. And in each of those cases, women were often told, we understand that the work of feminism may not be entirely over, but you've really made a lot of gains. And at this point in time, we really all need to focus on these other issues as much as women's issues. Now, of course, feminists are going to go ahead and tell you that all those other issues are women's issues. And in fact, that's exactly what you see in the 30s and 40s and 50s, that feminists are going to devote themselves to issues including labor organization, anti-war and pro-peace efforts, consumer protection, and domestic engineering, right? A really major feminist to think about from this time period who's super important, of course, is Eleanor Roosevelt, right? Under Eleanor Roosevelt, or maybe under the Roosevelt's reign in the White House, more women came to work for the government than had ever done so at any other time in history, and in numbers that still match the numbers of women who work in government today. This is the first time that the United States government had set up, for instance, a Bureau of Women's Affairs, bureaus of children's affairs, etc. And then later, we'll come back to this in our next unit in a couple weeks, Eleanor Roosevelt's going to come back in second wave feminism as the leader of one of the first equal opportunity commissions. All right, so we see women working on these specific kinds of issues. And what's interesting is in this period, the period between 1920 and 1960, I sometimes call it the interim period. A lot of people just see it as the last part of first wave feminism, and I think that's true. But we see a shift in how women present themselves in this period. As I said, in the earlier moment of first wave feminism, women were just as likely to represent themselves as new women fighting for equal access to the public sphere. They would either present themselves as new women fighting for access to the public sphere, or as true women engaged in municipal housekeeping, right? what we're going to see in the 30s and 40s, well, really the 40s and the 50s and the 60s in particular, is that in America, feminism becomes a little bit suspect and is occasionally even allied with communism and seen as a sort of dangerous and anti-American activity. So some women, of course, are going to continue to embrace their status as feminists and just go for it. But what you'll see is a lot of progressive-minded women in this period look back to the tactics that the municipal housekeepers used. And you're going to see women present themselves as housewife heroines. And that's the new image of women, right? And a housewife heroine is someone who is technologically and scientifically savvy, clearly a modern woman, but really defined by her caretaking and homemaking abilities, right? This is the person who is supposed to be at the heart and soul of America. And so what women would say is, okay, if you are telling us we have to go home because the home is the fundamental unit of America and that we should really embrace our work as caretakers and homemakers, we're happy to do it. Except we're not happy. Sometimes we're unhappy. And so what you would see is women would say, as a wife and mother, I can't really raise my kids in the shadow of a nuclear cloud. We have to get rid of nuclear arms in order to make sure our children thrive. So what you can see is it's kind of a revival of maternalist politics. But this time it's not about women going out and cleaning house as politicians. Instead, it's about women signaling that they are either happy or unhappy housewife heroines. And their ability to do traditional caretaking work in the home is being thwarted by the action of men outside the home, right? And so this is the kind of argument you're going to see. We even see this a little bit, for instance, if you've ever read the great environmentalist Rachel Carson's Silent Spring from the 1960s. It begins with a science fiction story, and it's about a woman looking outside her house and realizing there are no birds chirping anymore, right? So even here, you see a woman who was clearly out in the public sphere, was a well-known scientist, and frankly, a well-known activist and feminist, even someone like Carson taking on some of that rhetoric of domesticity and the home because it was effective and it worked really well. Okay. The other thing that you'll want to know about the interim period between 1920 and 1960 is that while it seems kind of like a low point or a quiet point for feminism, it's also the moment that actually that LGBTQIA plus activism is getting off the ground. In particular, we're going to see a woman named Edith Eade launch the first lesbian newsletter in the 1940s. It was called Vice Versa, and that would go on to become the foundation for LGBTQIA plus journalism today. And in fact, Edith Eade is in the Lesbian and Gay Journalists Hall of Fame. She's been celebrated in numerous documentaries. And I'm telling you this name now because we are going to study her in the fantasy unit, because she actually began her career as a science fiction and fantasy poet before she became an LGBTQIA plus journalist. And that's really cool, and I look forward to talking with you about that later in the semester. But just as a heads up, we start to see the first lesbian and gay journalists. We're seeing the first political groups. There's the Daughters of Bilitis, which is the first lesbian group, political organization in America, and also I think it's called the Mattachine Society, which was the first political organization for gay men. So this is starting to take off, even in a moment when there doesn't seem to be a lot of gender activism. So I do want to make that point. So, okay, now that you've got a sense of what's going on in feminism, in short, feminists from 1848 to about 1960 are really interested in securing their space in the public sphere and making sure that women's hopes and fears are represented in the public sphere. There will be different ways to do this: through liberal humanism and the figure of the new woman, through municipal housekeeping and the figure of the true woman, right? Later on, you'll be able to do this through the figure of the housewife heroine, etc. Okay. So, the one other thing I think I just really quickly point out, this is probably already obvious to you, is that first wave feminism tends to be pretty white. There are certainly women of color in it. from the beginning saying, hey, think about us, think about us. It also tends to be pretty straight and pretty cisgendered. Now, what's interesting about this is that we do know that individual feminists certainly engaged in a variety of sexual relations, often in lesbian relations as much as straight relations. And we know that a number of women experiment with patterns of life that now look like trans identity. But this wasn't really seen as central to the feminist fight at this point in time. So I just want to make that point, just so we're all on the same page, and that I acknowledge there are going to be limits to that moment, but there are opportunities as well. Opportunities and limits, always, right? Okay, so what's going on in science fiction at this time? Let's go over to that. Okay. Initially, you're going to see science fiction in the 1800s. It was published everywhere, in newspapers and magazines, in memoirs and books. And the genre didn't even have really a name at that point. There were lots of different names for science fiction. People would call it voyage extraordinaire, fantastic voyages, or romances of the future, or invention stories, or off-trail stories. Lots of different names for science fiction. Don't worry about it. That's cool. What happens though is as the genres start to develop over the 1800s, eventually magazines become the center of science fiction, especially in the United States. And a lot of action for science fiction happens in the United States in the early 20th century. So that's what we're going to focus on here. Okay, so what you're going to see is that as magazines become increasingly important to Americans, authors and editors who are working in the speculative genres are drifting to those magazines. And by the end of the 19th century, by like the 1880s, we have something called all-story magazines. And the all-story magazines published all kinds of genre fiction. So you could have a nurse story next to a romance story, next to a science fiction story, next to a Western, right? And in particular, you'll see women writing speculative fiction gravitating to one specific magazine. It's called Black Cat, the Black Cat. You should go look it up online. It's super cool looking, but it was a speculative all-story magazine that really so emphasizing fantasy, science fiction, and horror. Okay, so you're going to see a lot of women going to those magazines. By the 1920s and 30s, you have the rise of what's called the genre specialist magazine. These are magazines dedicated to specific genres of fiction and marketed to certain sets of readers. Right? Okay, so by the time these arise in the 20s and 30s, you're going to have, yes, okay. So the major magazine you want to know about from this time period is a magazine called Amazing Stories that was edited by Hugo Gernsback. You are going to hear his name, so you might as well know it. And knowing Amazing Stories is a good idea. We're going to be reading some stories, at least one story and maybe two this semester, that were edited by Gernsback, either for Amazing Stories or for his other magazine called Wonder Stories. All right, so the genre specialist magazines was where editors would say, science fiction is a thing, and here are some of its characteristics, just like we've been doing. Here are some of its editors, here are some of its authors, here's its history, here's its past and present. For Gernsback, I want to tell you a little bit about science fiction as Gernsback shaped it, because Gernsback's ideas for good science fiction are going to shape the science fiction we see women writing throughout this period. We'll see it retrospectively on earlier fiction, in that Gernsback was looking back on older fiction when he came up with definitions, and then people are going to be really influenced by them through at least about 1960. Okay, so Gernsback has 3 rules for good science fiction. The first is that it has to be didactic. That means it has to teach us something. Gernsback really wanted it to teach you something about science and society, or science and technology. He was one of the first people to build and sell radios, so he was really into new modes of technologically enabled communication. And he thought science fiction should teach us something about science and technology. Eventually, people, mostly women, would expand that and say, hey, Hugo, how about teaching us about society as well? That's going to be one of the great things women does. The next thing science fiction needs to have is prophetic vision. What that means is it should give us a vision of the future that excites scientists and engineers today and gets them thrilled about the idea of designing and inventing for a better future. Finally, Gernsback said, if you want people to really read this and get excited about science and technology, we have to have a specific narrative structure. And for him, he said science fiction should be about 25% science and 75% romance. Now, when you hear the word romance here, I'm using it in its traditional literary meaning as an action adventure, as an adventure story. So the idea of the romance goes all the way back to medieval literature and the idea of the medieval romance, the knight's romance, the adventures of a knight. So what he was talking about is that you should write stories that are 25% science, 75% action and adventure, right? Okay, cool. The other thing that Gernsback really encouraged was people really, he constructed a continuum of science fiction. And there are two different ends to science fiction, and you would see both types of stories published in his magazines. So at one end of the continuum, a lot of stories were thought experiments. Thought experiments are stories where you ask, what if? All science fiction asks what if, but with a thought experiment, you can do things that you couldn't do in the real world. They can be stories about, well, what if we develop this science and technology? What might that be like? Or what if women did rule the world? Or what if women were the engineers who made all of our sciences and technology? So those can be thought experiments. A thought experiment can happen in any subgenre, any style of science fiction. I think the key thing you want to think about with a thought experiment is it challenges us to think differently about the world. It challenges our assumptions about how science and society work. And for women, the thought experiment will also often challenge our ideas about gender and how sex and gender work. The other story type at the other end was the space opera. Space operas are big action adventure stories. As they sound, much as it sounds like, they tend to happen in it's a very specific story. They happen in outer space. They often involve hopping from planet to planet. Some other differences. So the thought experiment values thought and cooperation and introspection. The space opera typically values action, aggression, and competition. So that's going to be a key difference between those two. Now, again, these exist in continuums, and you can have stories that are both thought experiments and space operas. And in fact, that's one of the things I would like you to do with our readings for this week is identify where do you see elements of the thought opera and where do you see elements of the space opera, or the thought experiment and the space opera. All right. A last thing I want to note really quickly about Hugo Gernsback is that he has a lot of really interesting connections, both to the history of feminism and to the history of women in literature. So when Gernsback started publishing his first science fiction magazines, he was also one of the first people to publish women. And indeed, he was publishing the first women in science fiction within 3 years of starting his science fiction magazine. Now, when Gernsback started publishing women, he claimed to be surprised that women were writing science fiction. But my own research suggests that this was kind of a show. In fact, it was 100% of a show. We know that Hugo Gernsback regularly hired women as scientific and technological experts at his radio magazines. And we know he was an ardent enthusiast about the birth control movement and very friendly with Margaret Sanger. In an era when you were not supposed to run birth control ads, Hugo Gernsback did it. He was willing to take that chance. I think it makes sense if you think about it. Feminists, and especially feminists associated with the birth control movement, are thinking a lot like science fiction people. They're thinking about how we can use modern sciences and technologies to rationally build more manageable, more human scale, better futures for all. All right. And in fact, one of the early women science fiction writers with whom Gernsback was particularly friendly, Leslie Stone, said that after an initial meeting where everyone assumed she was applying for a secretarial job, she very quickly actually became one of the top authors of any gender in the Hugo Gernsback magazines. And Stone recalls that Gernsback quite liked the idea of women invading his field. And in terms of invasion, as I mentioned earlier, by the 1920s and 30s, and throughout the 20th century, women are going to comprise about 15% of all science fiction contributors. They work in all different areas of science fiction production, but women are especially strong at fiction writing, poetry writing. They own the poetry writing for sure. And there's a lot of science fiction poetry in the early magazines, and there's a lot of science fiction poetry today. Women also make a strong showing in art. And in fact, if you're interested in science fiction art, I want to recommend that you go Google Margaret Brundage, Brundage. Brundage was called the Queen of the Pulps and was one of the two most famous science fiction artists of her day. And you should go look at her work. It's very interesting. Just go look at it. We'll talk about it later. Okay, great. Let me keep moving along here. Another interesting thing to note is that while women in science fiction at this time often brought feminist ideas and sensibilities to their science fiction, they didn't see themselves either as feminist science fiction authors or as part of a group of women writers. The reality is, everyone involved in the early science fiction community was there to help build the genre. Now, how they did it differed from person to person, and some people, like Stone and like other women, brought feminist sensibilities with them. As we know, Gernsback rather liked that idea, and we also know that Gernsback's second in command, a man named David Lasseter, was actively involved in the progressive political movements of that day, including feminism, and he too was really excited to bring women into the fold. And if you think about it, what a great way to sell science fiction. It's such a hot genre that even housewives are reading and writing it, right? It's a great way to sell stuff. Okay, cool. Now, what happens to science fiction in the 1940s and 50s? You see a shift in the status of science fiction after World War II. Prior to World War II, science fiction was really a ghettoized genre. It was seen as sort of minor, a little bit primitive, and maybe even a little bit spicy. The covers often had either gigantic robots, like terrorizing little naked ladies, or gigantic naked ladies terrorizing human men. And according to the pornography codes and the mailing codes at the time, that made some science fiction pornography. So in some places, science fiction literally had to be sold under the counter with other pornography. In most places, that wasn't the case. But between the bright, almost seemingly primitive covers and the sort of reputation for a little spiciness, a lot of people didn't take science fiction too seriously at first. The irony, by the way, is that early science fiction is the least spicy thing you will ever read. But there you go. All right. Anyways, what happens, of course, is World War II. And all of a sudden, all of those crazy nuclear technologies and computers that science fiction authors had been writing about made them look like, as the New York Times said, prophets proven right by the course of events. Okay, so at this period, science fiction becomes really central to the American imagination and to the global imagination in general. In the US alone, you have 47 science fiction magazines in the 40s and 50s and leading up to the 60s. You also have, this is the heyday of science fiction radio and the beginning of science fiction television and science fiction film. Oh, you also get the first science fiction music at this time, the first operas and the first science fiction scores for movies. Cool. So a lot's going on, and once again, women are going to be there involved with it. Now, what's interesting is at first it didn't seem like maybe women were going to make it into this next wave of science fiction. What we see is just as America was gripped by a feminist backlash in the 30s and 40s, so too certain members of the science fiction community participated in feminist backlash and tried to minimize and erase the accomplishments of women in the field. Sadly, one of the major voices for feminist backlash was also the person who's often considered one of the major architects of modern science fiction. And this is John Campbell, who worked with Astounding Science Fiction. Campbell's Astounding Science Fiction became one of the best known and most popular science fiction magazines of the 40s and 50s. And for a long time, Campbell was seen as a tastemaker, as the next person, as the inheritor of Hugo Gernsback, and the person who was going to set down the next set of rules for good science fiction. And he did do all of that. Unlike Gernsback, however, Campbell was part of feminist backlash and reluctant to publish women. He famously claimed that women had never written good science fiction, and a number of other male editors also did this. And as they created the first science fiction anthologies, there were deliberate attempts to make sure that women were not included in these. Fortunately, as a number of women writers pointed out, Campbell was not the only game in town. There were 46 other magazines, at least 2 of which were every bit as big and bad as Amazing Stories. And what you'll see is that women in particular gravitated to a certain set of magazines. We're going to see a lot of women publishing with Anthony Boucher at the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Again, not super worried that you know these names or titles, but I just want you to hear them once, and some of you might get interested and go back and look at them more later. Boucher loved women's science fiction, and in fact, he introduced the world to a number of amazing major authors, and he celebrated women's science fiction as, quote unquote, a new kind of sensitive SF told from a women's point of view. There was another major magazine, Horace Gold's Galaxy, which in the late 1950s did an all-sex and gender issue, which again, I think points to the increasing sense that women were indeed an important part of the science fiction community. So women in this period still comprised about 15% of the science fiction community, but at this point they're making names for themselves not just as authors and artists and poets, but also as science journalists and editors as well. Women are also going to be central to the evolution of science fiction fandom. Women are involved in the creation of the first Amateur Press Association, which will become central to the dissemination of fan fiction. And of course, they're extremely active in fandom in general, doing everything from editing all poetry fan magazines, where you had to even write letters to the editor in poetry, to, as we will see, eventually lobbying TV stations to keep their favorite shows on. All right. Now, what's interesting is that even though women are at the same numbers in the science fiction community in the 40s and 50s as they were earlier, the community itself is beginning to treat them differently. And for the first time ever, we're starting to see women as a group of authors using a certain coherent set of tropes and themes and techniques to comment on science and society. As I noted before, Anthony Boucher and a lot of editors, they loved this kind of fiction. They called it, like I said, sensitive science fiction. I call it women's science fiction. This is science fiction that is not necessarily overtly feminist or calling itself feminist, and it's often published in periods when there doesn't seem to be a lot of feminist activity, but it's where women are clearly putting themselves front and center of the future imaginary, right? So, like I said, a lot of editors and authors really liked women's science fiction, but we also know that there was a small but vocal contingent of fans who really hated it. They called it heartthrob and diaper fiction, and they never wanted to see it again. They were in a minority, didn't quite work out their way. All right, and then so that's what happens. We go from having the original sort of women in science fiction, many of whom are bringing overtly feminist sensibilities to the genre, but not defining themselves as either exclusively female or feminist authors. And then by the 40s and 50s, what you're going to see is we have a new generation of women writers. A lot of the older generation of women drop out, and another generation comes in. And these authors, much like their political counterparts, are not necessarily going to say we are feminists or bring overtly, obviously feminist themes to their fiction, but instead they're going to use these ideas about happy and unhappy housewife heroines. All right, cool. All right, so finally, in the last part of this lecture, I want to talk to you a little bit about how women bring it all together and exactly what it was that they brought from feminism and women's progressive politics into classic science fiction. So first of all, I want to note that women, like men, accomplished a lot of firsts in the early science fiction community. And I'm going to give you a few names. You don't have to know them, but you may want to explore them later, or you may come across them later, and then you'll know a little bit about them. I want you to hear the name of Claire Winger Harris. She was the first woman to publish science fiction in the science fiction specialist magazines under her own name, and the first woman to win a science fiction writing prize. She came in third place in a contest, and that's how she got into Amazing Stories. She had actually been publishing in a different all-story magazine called Weird Tales before then, but that was her breakout as a science fiction author. And she became not just a leading author for Hugo Gernsback, but also the first author of either sex or any sex to create a taxonomy of science fiction story types. So in some ways, we can see Claire Winger Harris as the first science fiction scholar. And what's great is as she explored the types of storytelling available to science fiction authors, she was at the lead of actually inventing and creating and making those story types as well. Another name we're going to be reading, Leslie F. Stone. I had mentioned her earlier. Leslie F. Stone also accomplished a number of firsts. She wrote the first and published the first science fiction story to be told from a female perspective, the first science fiction story where aliens beat humans at their own colonial games, and she imagined the first Black astronauts in science fiction. In fact, her writing was so powerful that not only was she considered one of the great authors of her time, but we know in retrospect that her fiction inspired a 16-year-old Jewish boy from Brooklyn named Isaac Asimov to try his own hand at this kind of storytelling. Later, we'll have authors like Judith Merril, who will become the first woman and perhaps one of the first science fiction authors altogether to have one of her original stories adapted and turned into a made-for-TV movie. Other names you might know, I've already mentioned Edith Ede, who went by the name Lisa Ben, or Tigrina. That was her science fiction and fantasy pen name. We'll be talking more about Tigrina in our fantasy unit, but she was, as far as we know, the first member of the science fiction community to take what she learned about writing and publishing standards and then use them in a different genre. And in particular, she used what she learned as an editor and author in science fiction fandom to create the first lesbian newsletter. That's pretty cool. Okay, other major contributions that women made. Now we're going to go on to the major contributions. All right, so women accomplished a bunch of firsts. Cool to know that. Here are the contributions, and these are most important because this is really what I want to look at in our stories. Where do you see these science fiction things happening in the stories that we have for this week? So 3 contributions. The first thing that women do to make classic science fiction better and the great thing that we remember it as is character development. When men write science fiction, and many women, science fiction is often considered the literature of ideas rather than a literature of character. But women consistently did both. They brought character development to their big ideas. In particular, I think this was important for women because when women came into science fiction, there were very limited female character options. So let me take you through those now. When men wrote early science fiction, they tended to write women in one of 2 ways. They either wrote them as love interests, who could become damsels in distress, of course, to rescue, or they wrote them as beautiful alien monsters, BAMs, right? Women who are stronger and more powerful than men, and both attractive and alarming because of that. All right. Women didn't really see themselves, obviously, as being sisters of tomorrow just by being love interests or beautiful alien monsters. And so what you're going to see is that women in this time period, not only are they going to give us character depth, they're going to have to do interiority, tell us how characters are thinking and feeling, doing nuanced conversations and relationships and transactions between people, but they're going to develop new character types as well as they imagine themselves as the people leading the way into tomorrow. So perhaps not surprisingly, inspired by municipal housekeeping and domestic engineering, you're going to see women imagine themselves as lady scientists and lady astronauts. Right? And specifically gendered in that way, just as domestic engineering was engineering from a feminine and perhaps feminist point of view, lady scientists and lady astronauts operate out of feminine and feminist viewpoints. Obviously, you're also going to see domestic engineers. The domestic engineer, Ellen Swallow Richards, becomes the prototype for domestic engineers written by women across the world. So look for domestic engineers in our stories. We're also going to see that women didn't mind being treated as alien others as long as they could be in control, right? So instead of getting beautiful alien monsters, you'll get alien queens. And often those alien queens will have characteristics of the beautiful alien monster, but within her and within the female author's imagination, this becomes regal and something to desire rather than something to fear. Sometimes it becomes something to question too. We'll talk about that. Finally, we're going to see women imagining themselves, especially in 40s and 50s science fiction, as housewife heroines. We'll see it earlier as well, right? But there's that long tradition of progressive women drawing on conventional and even conservative ideas about women as caretakers and homemakers. And that will translate into housewife heroines. And housewife heroines can be happy, heroic heroines who really literally use either domestic insight to solve a scientific and technological problem or some kind of domestic technology to solve a problem. Okay, a few other things just so you know. When you're looking at women's science fiction, men's science fiction from this period tends to draw on Darwinian ideas about competition and imagines humans and aliens as necessarily competing for scarce resources. Women tend to draw on equally popular alternate conceptions of Darwinian cooperation to think about human and aliens as possibly working together to build better worlds. So again, what you'll often see in women's science fiction in the classic era is an emphasis on cooperation over competition, whether that's between women or between men and women. And even when you see competition, it's often softened or competition for the sake of cooperation. So there's a wonderful story by Leslie Stone that we're not reading called Into the Void. And it's a man and a woman are on a spaceship that was supposed to land on Mars, but something goes wrong and they get shot into another galaxy. So while they're waiting to get to this other galaxy, they have competitions to see who can roll the best cigarette or who can do the best job getting the dishes done quickly and efficiently. And I love this, right? Because these are like such minor competitions. And in particular, the dishes, right? It's a kind of competition that makes like the spaceship, their world, better for both of them. I think the cigarettes probably worked the same way in the 1920s. You get the point here. Obviously, then, the other thing you're going to see is that as women are creating these new character types, they're implicitly going to revise the male-female relations that we often see in men's science fiction from this time. And it give women much more active and central roles in the world of tomorrow. All right, so the second thing that women do is they expand what counts as the scene of science fiction action. When men write science fiction, they tend to emphasize scientific and technological and sometimes economic and political activity in public spaces, in the public sphere, and in particular in spaces like the laboratory and the launchpad. To a certain extent, that makes sense. That's where a lot of science and technology gets done, and certainly the big, grand, sexy, world-changing technologies, or at least so it seems. This is where women science fiction writers ask us to think differently. Women science fiction authors remind us that most of us don't really experience scientific and social change in laboratories and launchpads. Most of us have our first and frankly most intense technological experiences in the home. This would have been especially true at the turn of the last century when running water and electricity and the first refrigerators were really transforming household labor for women, right? And so it's no surprise that women themselves want to claim to be technoscientific experts. And as they're doing that, they're saying, hey, look, let's remember that there are other places where scientific stories or science fiction stories can happen. And in particular, they're going to start setting stories in kitchens and in schools. Sometimes also in delivery rooms as well. In fact, one of my very favorite stories from the 1930s is called A Baby on Neptune, and it was co-authored by Claire Winger Harris, that first woman to publish in the science fiction magazines. She actually had a science degree from Smith College, which had the best laboratories in America at the time. And she co-authored a story with a guy, Miles Brewer, who was a doctor, and it was called A Baby on Neptune, and it was all about how humans and the gas giants of Neptune learn to communicate with each other when they have to work together to deliver a baby. I think that's pretty cool. All right. So finally, the last thing you're going to see, the last contribution that women make is thinking about how science and technology can be used to both metaphorically and literally construct and reconstruct sex and gender relations. So what we'll see is that when women think about science and technology as a liberating force, and they certainly will in this period, or as an oppressive force sometimes, either way, they're going to challenge our assumptions about nature and what does it mean to be a natural man or woman? What does it mean to have a natural scientific or technological talent? Those kinds of things. we're also going to see that they're going to encourage thinking about radical new modes of living. If we can create and recreate our bodies in different ways, why should we continue to have the same kinds of homes and families that we've had in the past? And that's it, my friends. We've done it. We've gotten through classic feminism and classic science fiction. So again, for this unit and this week, we're going to be focusing on how women think about themselves as scientific, technological, political, and sometimes even economic and sexual actors in the public sphere, and how it is they use science fiction to tell those stories about what it might mean to be a sister of tomorrow. All right, thanks so much. And so what I want you to do for this week is go through your assigned stories and ask yourself, is this a thought experiment or a space opera or both? What character types do these authors put into play, and what does that allow them to say about women's place in the world? Finally, you might even think a little bit about, are these stories that are really celebrating, traditional, straight up liberal humanist feminism, or are these stories that are celebrating women as mothers and municipal housekeepers? These are all great things to look at, and I can't wait to talk about them with you later. Thank you.